So let's do this a few more times with a few sources. As always, just make a few notes for each source. That the more we practice these things, the easier they'll be when it comes to writing them in the exam. So we're going to try and use the COP model, or you can still do NOPCAT if you want, whichever works best for you. So content, what does the source tell us? Some own knowledge that supports what the source tells us, and then the provenance, okay? So that's NOP if we were doing NOPCAT, nature, origin, and purpose. So pause the screen, make some little annotations on source A. Unpause and we'll have a quick discussion of these sources. We won't spend too long on them, just to get you thinking and get you practicing all the time. We need to be getting some content out of it, so a quote. We need to be getting some own knowledge to back up what we're reading, and we need to consider the provenance of the source. All these things considered, we then need to start thinking about how useful are these sources. In this case, let's use an example of how useful are these sources for an inquiry into the Munich Putsch. Okay, so give yourself a couple of minutes to make some notes and observations, and then we'll unpause and feedback. Okay, so the first thing that we'll see, we'll do the provenance first. Okay, so from a report in September of 1923. So the nature of source A, is it an official report from the Bavarian police? That should immediately make you think, well, it's got to be fairly useful. It's an official source. September 1923, okay, that's the origin of the source, and that should immediately start ringing some alarm bells to you, thinking, well, actually, the Munich Putsch was in November 1923. So you're starting to think already, just by taking that time to look at the provenance, that this source may well have a different slant, and it may not be very useful at all. So let's have a little look at some of the content. It says, as a result of rising prices and unemployment, the workers are bitter. The patriotic are at fever pitch, and because of the failure of the resistance in the Ruhr. So this source is really useful for us if it said an inquiry into the causes of the Munich Putsch. So if it was the causes of the Munich Putsch, we can pick out the unemployment and rising prices and the workers being angry. That's why the Munich Putsch happened. So this content, we'd pick out the quote. We put it in quote marks, we'd quote from the source. We then put in some own knowledge. Now we know why they were unhappy and unemployed and bitter, because of hyperinflation. We know that. So we bring in some own knowledge about that. Perhaps those people who lost their savings, pensioners, all of the things that we've looked at already in the last session, you can start bringing in to this source analysis and how this source might be useful, looking at the causes of the Munich Putsch. But the second half of the source, even though it's a small source, gives us another really clear and good topic to discuss. The patriotic are at fever pitch, it says. Those people who are really proud to be German, fever pitch, they're at a frenzy, all right? They're so upset with how 1923 has gone. But this suggests a second reason why they're angry, and that is because of the farce in the Ruhr, okay? So the fact that Ebert told them to go on strike, I guess these nationalists, these right-wing extremists, I think they were expecting or hoping that they would fight the French and you know, defend our country and have some pride. So just this small source, we get this really good idea about some of the causes of the Munich Putsch. So the economic causes and the failure of their pride, really, the loss of pride in how Ebert dealt with the invasion of the Ruhr. So hopefully you picked out some of those things. So let's do this again for source B. Okay, again, similar thing. Pause the screen, make some notes. Obviously, there's a few more words this time, but that is more helpful actually because it gives us more to be able to pick out. Even if we are having a bit of a mental break of knowledge, when we read the source, hopefully that'll trigger some of the things that we know in our minds. So pause the screen, and then when you're ready, come back and we'll see what we can pick out from this. All right, so we'll start with provenance again, just see what we've got. So an announcement, that's the nature of the source. It's an announcement. It's being said, and it's being said by Kahr. So we know that Kahr is the leader of the Bavarian government. We know he's right wing, and we know he's called this meeting that doesn't involve Hitler or the Nazis. The origin of the source is the 9th of November, 1923. So that's the second day of the Munich Putsch. And its purpose we'll work out as we read through it. So Kahr, and he's there, remember, so that's probably why this makes it a bit more useful. He is there. He's going through the whole Munich Putsch. He's had a gun at his head. So what he says right now probably is what happened, certainly through his eyes, but you can add your own knowledge to make sure you see. So he says, the deception and treachery of ambitious rebels have changed a peaceful meeting, held to encourage people to work together, into a scene of disgusting violence. The declarations of support forced from myself, General von Lossow and Colonel Seisser, at the point of the gun are null and void. The National Socialist German Workers' Party and the troops who have gathered to support them are banned. Okay, so this is quite a powerful announcement. It's after the Munich Putsch, and Carr has said, basically, we supported them, but we were forced to. So there's loads of stuff in there, and hopefully as we read that source, or you've listened and read it yourself, it's supporting what we know has happened in this Munich Putsch. So some content to pick out is that he was forced, and was General von Lossow and Colonel Seisser. They were forced to support this disgusting violence. So you would then hopefully put some own knowledge in there about the gun and how he arrived on the 8th of November at night and no one knew he was coming. It was all a bit extreme, but that's what helped take over. You also know that the consequences of it were the Nazi Party were embarrassed, humiliated, 16 Nazis were killed, all of that stuff. That would be your own knowledge to support what happened. And you also know that Carr doesn't like Hitler. So that would explain the quotes or the content. The deception and treachery of ambitious rebels has changed a peaceful meeting. So basically what he's saying is these guys just turned up. So another nice source, there's probably other things we can pick out, but just to try and, I just want you getting in the habit of picking out bits of sources that we can hopefully use for technique-wise, remember the quotes added to own knowledge, and then saying how and why this makes this source useful for an inquiry into the Munich Putsch. So this source would be more of an aftermath. So maybe how useful is this source for an inquiry into the aftermath of the Munich Putsch or what happened after it. But just for this instance, hopefully you picked out some of those things, and perhaps more importantly, you've got lots of own knowledge that would support what Carr has said in this announcement. The fact that it's an announcement by him, remember, we know that as our provenance check makes this source very useful straight away because Carr was there. All right, so a couple more to do, and then we'll finish this session. But it's just good practice to get into the habit of, and remember that the source useful question is the same for the trenches part of paper 1. Okay, so 2 sources. We're being asked how useful these 2 sources are for an inquiry into a specific topic. So source C, a photograph this time. Again, write some notes, some ideas, pause for a couple of minutes, and then when you're ready to come back and we'll move on. All right, so source C, a photograph of Hitler's shock troop in Munich on the morning of the putsch on the 8th of November 1923. So photograph, provenance. It's a snapshot in time. It shows us what was happening. It's Hitler's troops. We can see that they are in their uniforms, so the SA, the brown shirts, and we know it's on the 8th of November 1923, so the origin is the day of the Munich Putsch. All right, so hopefully you picked out those really obvious things, but it shows us, doesn't it, that they've got their flag, they've got their vehicle, and they are going through Munich to take over Munich and take over this Bavarian government. So it shows us what we would expect to see based on our own knowledge of what happened on this day. Some extra own knowledge, remember that there were 600 SA men who burst into the beer hall, into the pub, interrupting the meeting, and then on the next day we've got the 3,000 Nazis. So this source, other than source A, which was obviously talking about the causes, source B was clearly talking about the aftermath. This source definitely seems to be talking about during the event itself. So hopefully, again, you've managed to pick out some things from there. Now, a lot of people think when they see a picture source, so that's great, it's much easier, but I don't know. I think sometimes written sources are a little bit easier because they give you something to pick out and quotes, whereas you have to really work out what's going on in a picture. But still, a quote, obviously you can't quote a picture, but you can say source C clearly shows. That's just the same as source B clearly says. All right, so let's have a look at source D, same again. So it's our painting that we've already seen. We've already talked about it, so we maybe don't need to spend so long on this one. It's a Nazi source. in 1940. So Hitler is well and truly in power. World War II has started, and this painting has been made. Possibly, if we're thinking about a purpose in this, in the provenance, is to try and raise everyone's confidence in Hitler and remind everyone how brave he is, how wonderful he is, and look, when he faced the army head on, and he's still here going strong today. Basically, get behind Hitler in this Second World War. So that possibly be the purpose of it. It's a painting, so it's always going to be somebody's interpretation of the events, and it's portrayed Hitler again, this hero in the middle, standing firm, hand up, ready to fight, despite the fact there's an army with guns meters away from you. So that's part of the provenance. Then content, we can see, we've already talked about, it shows this band of Nazis in the streets of Munich. Match that to your own knowledge. Do we know that happened? Yes, we do. 3,000 Nazis marching through the streets of Munich. And the content speaks for itself. We can see the army. A bit of our knowledge, you'd add the 16 Nazis, 3 police officers, and the whole thing being over in minutes. Stuff like that. Okay? So hopefully you've been able to annotate this source quite well now, because we've looked at it a couple of times in this session. All right, so source G, and this gets a little bit interesting now because it's a letter written by Hitler himself. So it's in 1924, so it's a year after or so. So remember, he's in prison and he's serving his 5-year sentence. That's actually only 9 months. So pause, annotate, make some notes on this source, and then let's see what we can pull out of it. Okay, so provenance, the nature of this source, it's a letter. All right, its origin is written by Hitler in 1924 while he's in prison. So this is automatically going to be a pretty useful source because it's coming from Hitler himself. You may not agree with what he's saying, but what it does do is it tells us and it shows us that actually he is what he's thinking and feeling. So he says in this source, when I resume active work, it will be necessary to pursue a new policy. Instead of working to achieve power by an armed coup, we will have to hold our noses and enter the Reichstag. If outvoting them takes longer than outshooting them, at least the result will be guaranteed by their own constitution. Sooner or later, we shall have a majority, and after that, we'll have Germany. Okay, so he's on a bit of a rant in this letter, but it certainly shows us what we know. Remember that term, ballot, not bullet. This letter clearly shows that Hitler has decided after the failure of the Munich Putsch, he needs to change his tactics. He's saying it himself. He's not happy about it. The way he talks about the Reichstag, we have to hold our noses when we go in. And outvoting them take longer than outshooting them, and so be it. He's still saying the same thing will happen, we'll get rid of them. So this is really important because in 1924, this source gives us a real turning point into the Nazis' tactics and how they think that they're going to get into power. It should match your own knowledge, particularly the ballot, not bullet. He's realised following the failure of the Munich Putsch that he cannot just take power because he tried it and he failed. He talks about the armed coup there. That was the Munich Putsch. So the content is really easy to match up to your own knowledge of the Munich Putsch. So a source like this would give us plenty to say. All right, so this might well be a useful source, particularly for the consequences of the Munich Putsch. But still, even if it's just about the Munich Putsch generally, it gives us a real good insight that the Munich Putsch changed the Nazi Party's tactics. And Hitler has been clever enough to realise that. All right, so he's written this letter while he's in prison. A really useful source, actually, not just because it's by Hitler, but it certainly does tell us that the Nazi Party have realised they do need to change their tack a little bit, because attempting an armed coup like that, again, probably, even though the judges are probably a little bit right-wing, he may not get away with it a second time. All right, so that's what he's realised. Source E, this is difficult, this one. So maybe take a little bit longer before you come back to this one. It's a cartoon, so it's been designed to show something. Normally cartoons are critical or designed to mock, particularly when it's political. So have a little look at the provenance and then see what you get. All right, so this source actually is quite difficult. Let's see what we can work out. The provenance of the source is 1924, so the origin. It's a cartoon from a political magazine, and it's showing us that Hitler is setting fire to the town. He is being carried by von Lossow, the head of the German army in Bavaria, and von Kahr, the leader of the state government in Bavaria. Meanwhile, Kahr shouts out, "Officer, arrest that arsonist up there." Okay, so that's a little bit of information that it gives us, and hopefully that triggers to you the story of the Munich Putsch. So Hitler is going through the streets setting fire. This is what this cartoon suggests. I'm not necessarily sure that that's what happened, but it's a destructive attack, isn't it? That's what's going on. Hitler is being held up by von Lossow and Kahr. Remember, as we've just seen in one of the earlier sources, they believe, or Kahr believes, they were forced to support this destruction. That's your own knowledge, and that explains why in this source, despite the fact Kahr is carrying Hitler, he's also shouting to the police, "Arrest him up there." So he's saying, "Come and get him," and that hopefully matches your own knowledge that Kahr went and informed the authorities. So you know that he went and told the police and the army about this armed coup or this attack from the Nazi party. So this source really does show us that. We can see it at night because it's dark with the stars. That star at the top is a swastika, so giving us the impression that it's a Nazi source. It just looks a bit like chaos, really, and destructive and damage being caused by Hitler on this night. So some content really lovely. The source gives us good information at the top in the provenance, really, but we can sort of see whether we think this is useful or not. Even though it's a cartoon, it represents, doesn't it, what we know happened on this night. And the content is very clear, what it's showing, and your own knowledge. So again, on source E, I really do think that we could get an awful lot out of that in describing and suggesting why this source might be useful for the Munich Putsch. Now this, again, might be a source related to the events of the Munich Putsch rather than the causes or the aftermath or consequences. So I like this source. It's a bit harder at first glance, but once you break it down and you start putting into it its own knowledge and what it shows us, then actually it's quite a nice source to look at. So officially then, how this might look in an exam. So I'm going to let you do an actual how useful question. So this will take you maybe 20 minutes or so. The question is, how useful are sources C and D for an inquiry into the importance of the Munich Putsch for the Nazis? So there's a very specific focus to this question. It's an inquiry into how important the Munich Putsch was for the Nazis. All right. Now remember, when we do these source usefulness questions, we've got to be positive. We don't want to immediately jump into this source is not useful because it's only one, it's only by this person, and it was too late, it was after the time. We've really got to make sure that we are positive and we try and find things that make the source useful. So content, what does the source say? We know because it says, so we quote. We use our own knowledge to back up those quotes and then look at the provenance. Who made it, when was it made, what is the source, and why does that make it useful? So this is a mark scheme, just to give you a bit of an idea or a recap on what you need to do for the exam, with some hints and tips at the bottom. So you can pause the screen, have a little read of them, maybe make some notes of the two or three bullet points that you want to focus on this source question, and then I'll put the two sources on the next screen, pause the screen there, read the sources, annotate them just like we've done for the last 4 or 5 sources, pick out the things that you want to say, and then attempt to write this answer. Remember, on our YouTube channel, there is a how to answer this source utility question as well. If you've forgotten how to do it, it's effectively just 2 big paragraphs, source C first, then source D, how they are useful for an inquiry into the importance of the Munich Putsch. You've got to keep coming back to the idea of how these sources were useful to a historian, trying to figure out how important was it. Was the Munich Putsch important at all? It was. It definitely was important to change their political tactics, but it also got them famous and managed to get their message across better than perhaps if they were successful. So you have a little think about all those things in this session, some knowledge as well. Pause the screen and then write your answer, and then as you go forward, so try not to let the video go on too far because there'll be a pretty good answer giving you an idea of what you could have said, but try and have a go first before you actually look at the answer. Okay, so pause it here on the sources. The bits in red are in the provenance. Remember, that's the NOP, N-O-P. nature, origin, purpose, and then the actual sources themselves. Okay, so good luck with this. Have a good go at it. Use your notes if you need to, if you're really struggling for some content and some own knowledge, but just try to make sure you've got some good examples, some good quotes from each source, and some good examples of own knowledge that back it up, and then say how these things are useful. All right, so just for example, to get you started, source C, Hitler is talking to this Kurt Ludek character in 1924. He's a former Nazi supporter and he breaks away with Hitler in 1934 and becomes a critic. So immediately you might get a little bit negative. You say, oh, Ludek's bound to say this, that, and the other, blah, blah, blah. He's decided he's turned against Hitler. But don't allow that to happen. Think about it more objectively, that Hitler is talking to Kurt Ludek. So what this source says is a conversation between two people who are there around the time. Okay, so although it maybe is written long after, you can then consider how that affects its usefulness, but don't decide that it's a complete disaster just because it was written so long after the event. Okay, so pause the screen with the sources on and then begin writing your answer in your book, on paper, or on your computer. Obviously, anything that you do right get marked as well by your teacher. Okay, and then we'll have a look at a reasonably good answer. Not necessarily perfect, but a good answer. Okay, so hopefully that was pretty useful just to stop and try and put all of this together. Maybe it'd be good to use your storyboard or do the storyboard now if you haven't already. Pretty close to actually doing the topic. It's a useful topic, it's an important topic. I think it's a straightforward topic as well. So the sooner we can get this Munich Putsch into our heads, definitely the better. Okay, so let's see this good answer. So we can see, we'll start with source C first. It says source C is useful because it shows Hitler recognized the Munich Putsch was important. It demonstrated to him that the Nazis could not come to power through an armed coup, but that they would instead have to achieve power by being elected. The source is useful for showing us that Hitler had believed the Munich Putsch was a good way to come to power, because he wouldn't have done it otherwise, but after he realised that he would be in a more secure position if he was voted in, even if this was a slower option. So we know that he was happy to wait if it took longer, because we've learned that in this session, haven't we? Furthermore, source C was said by Hitler to his close friend and supporter Kurt Ludek at the time. As Ludek was trusted, we can suggest that the source is useful, as this is Hitler's accurate opinion. Our own knowledge shows us that. We know that he went for the ballot not bullet approach. Hitler in the source does not acknowledge that the Munich Putsch was a disaster, even though it took only 100 policemen 3 minutes to stop the Nazis. Okay, so in this source it suggests it was a great success and he's pushed them to needing to change his ways, but it doesn't actually talk about the disaster that it was. So there's a good opportunity to some own knowledge in there. 3,000, 100 policemen, 16 dead Nazis, which we'll see in a sec. Hitler instead claims that the Munich Putsch was a success for revealing to him a better way to take power. This is limited in its usefulness because it does not reflect that the putsch was a disaster that led to 16 Nazis being killed and him being put on trial for treason. So although we're trying to be positive, we can obviously still always say that how a source is a little bit less useful, but it's important to not go on a rant about how a source is not useful. So in this case, we've got a small statement there, but this is limited in usefulness because it does not reflect that the putsch was actually a short-term disaster. The purpose of the source is to reassure other Nazis that Hitler knows how to lead the party after they fail to achieve their goal. So don't lose faith in Hitler. All right, believe in him. All right, it didn't go to plan, but he's such a good leader. He's realised, he's learned from this mistake. This affects its usefulness as Hitler has to ensure he appears to be an able leader. He is not going to admit that it is his own idea to seize power that led to the party being banned. So again, in what the source is saying, we can work out actually the purpose of why it was made is to try and keep Hitler looking strong. All right, so that's source C. Then we do the same. A little analysis for source D. So source D is useful for showing that even if the putsch was a disaster, Hitler actually turned the trial to his benefit. Through being accused of treason in a public court, people began to listen to him and study his ideas. Because of this, and we've got a quote, Hitler transformed defeat into triumph. Now, this would be our long-term success, wouldn't it? We know from the trial that Hitler became famous. He was given a platform and he delivered his speeches attacking the Weimar Republic and the Treaty of Versailles and all of it. Source D is really useful in showing us this because we know it is our own knowledge, but the content also shows us how important the Munich Putsch was for the Nazis. If it hadn't happened, he wouldn't have got this trial, he wouldn't have been given the platform. So keep that in mind. Then let's have a little look at the provenance of it. It says source D was written by an American journalist living in Germany in the 1930s. The book was not published until the 1960s. This perhaps that what he was writing was so sensitive that he feared publishing it in the 30s. So the 1930s, when the Nazis are in power, with the Gestapo and the concentration camps and all of those things. So there's no way that this journalist would have been able to write these things in the 1930s. So although it's written many, many years later, what he's saying in the 1960s is probably the truth because he's got no fear. There's no one who's going to come knocking on his door in the middle of the night and taking him away to a camp. There's no Gestapo. So probably, realistically, what he's saying is true. All right? So possibly he could not acknowledge that this was a defeat. However, Schirra is actually positive about Hitler, commenting on his skill in transforming this defeat into triumph. As an American, safe and able to write freely 30 years later, we can arguably trust this account. All right, so hopefully you got a bit of an idea and you managed to pick out something similar to this. The own knowledge you should be looking at, the ballot not bullet, the trial. You should have things like that in your answer. So this is a good answer as it makes use of both the sources. We've got provenance in both of them. We've got some own knowledge in both of them. And we picked out content from both of the sources. All right. So the failure of the putsch was not seen as important as the attention Hitler gained from it. But he wouldn't have got that attention and he wouldn't have got that platform in the court case if he hadn't have attempted to take over the country. So we've got to keep all that in mind. Remember, short and long-term causes. So this whole story, the Munich Putsch, is definitely one rooted in interpretations of whether you think it was successful or not. And the sources we've looked at hopefully give you a bit of a confidence boost, really, that actually we can do these sources, despite the fact that we do worry about them a little bit. If we know the story, then we can use the sources because the sources should just remind us about our own knowledge and what we do know. Okay, so that's this session done. A really important session, a turning point in our story. Following this, we'll have a little look at Stresemann from now. So we're going to leave the Nazi Party a little bit. Let's just, in our heads, remember that he's imprisoned. The Nazi Party are embarrassed. They've gone away. They're banned. And we enter Stresemann's Germany. It's called the Golden Years. So effectively what that means as we set this up is that Germany improves dramatically under Stresemann. And obviously when times are good, then there is no need for extreme parties. We've already talked about that earlier on in some of the earlier sessions. But when times are good, we don't need extreme left or extreme right. So the Nazi Party effectively, well, they just drift away into what we call the lean years of the Nazi Party. They go quiet, they go a little bit underground, but what they do is they reorganize themselves, ready like a snake, coiled and ready to pounce or strike as soon as they get an opportunity. And that is effectively what happens in 1929 with the Wall Street crash. That is the new Nazi Party's opportunity, and they do strike, and they do strike with a vengeance.